Hi, I'm Diego Rivetti. I'm a senior debt specialist at the World Bank and lead author of the report. This report is the first comprehensive assessment of debt transparency in developing economies. It presents the current challenges and outlines policy reforms to address them. The report draws upon surveys and novel data, for instance about resource-backed loans, as well as new tools such as this one, the World Bank Debt Reporting Heat Map. This tool tracks the level of disclosure of debt statistics by the national authorities on an annual basis. One of the most striking findings of the study is that nearly 30% of low-income countries have not disclosed any debt data to their own citizens in the last 2 years. Also, when available, debt statistics tend to cover only central government loans and securities, omitting other public sector components and debt instruments. Now, a point that the report makes is that lack of transparency is not necessarily a consequence of deliberate action, the famous hidden debt, but is often the result of weak legal and operational frameworks. In addition, international statistics and accounting standards exist, but they are not enforceable. This results in a very convoluted reporting system where different definitions, coverage, and evaluation methods are used. This chart here gives you an idea of the complexity of the current reporting system for a borrowing country. This includes direct reporting by the countries on its website, as well as indirect channels, such as reporting to the World Bank, the IMF, and credit rating agencies. Creditors keep their own tallies and report to organizations such as the OECD. And meanwhile, a growing number of private firms, academic institutions also try to fill the gaps by putting together often fragmentary information from a variety of public sources. This convoluted system explains why, when we look for debt data, we find significant differences across sources, equivalent to up to 30% of a country's GDP. No, in fact, the report also expands the definition of debt transparency to cover not only the availability of debt figures, but also the transparency of debt operation. Let me give you 3 examples of debt operation that tend to be opaque. First, domestic debt. In particular, since the start of the pandemic, many low-income countries have been accumulating arrears that typically go unreported. At the same time, countries have increasingly relied on domestic market, which is positive because they tend to be a more stable source of funding, but may also pose transparency challenges. Let's take a look at the World Bank heat map on domestic debt security, which shows how transparent countries are when they issue their local debt. The heat map tracks 5 indicators that are critical for domestic borrowing. The first category is the share of domestic issued through auctions. In this area, only 41% of low-income countries use transparent market-based auction as their main issuing mechanism. The second example of opaque debt operation is resource-backed loans. Let's look at the extent of these loans in Africa. We found there were 11 countries, shaded here, with debt that is collateralized by the country's natural resources. And that amounted to nearly 10% of all new borrowing in sub-Saharan Africa between 2004 and 2018. Yet, no country reports collateralization details. And even the existence of this debt is often not disclosed because these are instruments that are not systematically recognized and classified as debt. And the final example of less transparent operation is non-tradable external debt. And this includes loans that may get privately restructured or central bank operations that are used to facilitate external borrowing rather than to implement monetary policy. In the report, we offer a number of policy recommendations for each of the key actors involved: borrowers, lenders, and international financial institutions. I will mention 2 for each of them. First, on the borrower side, invest in capacity and systems to produce good debt data, thus reducing the need for ad hoc reporting to external agents. And second, reform the legal framework to make it conducive to transparency, for instance, by defining public debt according to international standards, specifying the borrowing authority, or requiring regular audits. On the creditor side, a first recommendation is to limit the scope of confidentiality clause and refrain from those that require secrecy. A second recommendation is to publish granular information on their lending portfolio, as encouraged by the G20 operational guidelines for sustainable financing. And finally, for the international financial institutions, one improvement would be to streamline and consolidate data collection processes and resulting database. A second important reform will be to provide a regular assessment of the country's adherence to international statistical and accounting standards. As you can see, debt transparency requires broad international consensus and commitment by all parties. Only with that can we strengthen the ability to manage and prevent future debt crises.